Okay. Am I audible? Friends, can anyone respond?
Yes, Danny, we can hear you.
Yes, Danny.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the confirmation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. I'm Daniel, a Livelihood Technical Specialist for Non-Farm Sector from World Vision India. Today, we are happy and excited to present a webinar on livelihood during pandemic, challenges and opportunity. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. The entire webinar will take for 2 hours. It is divided into 4 parts: inaugural address as a first part, and followed by the technical session. And we have Q&A, and the last session will be concluding remarks. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your Zoom. I'll bring them up during the presentation, and I will inform very beginning that we have a separate time for question and answer too. So without further ado, we will turn this time over inaugural session. I would like to welcome Mr. Madhav Vellankunda, our National Director, CEO of World Vision India, for this webinar. Ever since Mr. Madhav has joined as MD, he has brought a charisma and momentum in the development programs carried out by World Vision across the country. In the recent days, a number of webinars and researchers programs were initiated by Mr. Madhav, which is in now connection with the topics relevant to the time and contribute to the development of our nations. I now request Mr. Madhav to share the welcome address and introduce the chief guest and the special guest for the inaugural and take over the session. Over to Mr. Madhav.
Thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon to everybody who have joined from various parts of the country. And a special warm welcome to our esteemed guests and our chief guests. And it is an absolute delight to join with all of you on behalf of World Vision India, and I'm absolutely delighted. The pandemic has actually created so much of a disruption in many lives that a lot of things have been reset. Some of the gains in development sector have been offset by the losses that we have made due to the pandemic. And of course, the new normal and the various changes that have occurred to the way that people have worked and related to life itself is a testament to the extent of the pandemic and its effects. According to one of the studies that was recently released by Azim Premji Foundation, there is an estimation of 230 million people would have slipped back into poverty at a rate of $5 a day wage rate. 230 million people would have slipped back into that poverty. That is an astounding number when you really look at it in terms of the real economic impact this is going to have. When we look at the kind of an impact that this pandemic has created, particularly on the lives and the livelihood, sometimes the effect has not just on the adults alone, but it is also on the children. And their own well-being was affected because the parents' livelihood was disrupted. And that data is slowly coming through. And these after effects will long live after this pandemic is over. The poorest of the 10%, their per capita incomes in October 2020 were 42% below their levels compared in October 2019. And that is a very big number. And the unemployment rate is almost about close to 15 million jobs were lost in May 2021 alone. And when we really look at the disruption that is happening, the three critical areas that are coming is a three critical shifts that have happened to say is one is the loss of income. An average household at 17% lower income in nominal rate terms compared to the year in 2019. Compared to 2019, in 2020, there is a 17% lower income. That's a shift that has happened. While people may have stayed on in the job or still continue to have an income, but their income levels have dropped. Of course, some of them have even lost their jobs. The second shift also happened was the gender shift. The number of women who have lost the job and their livelihood during the pandemic is disproportionately higher than the male. The third shift that happened was a lot of people moved into the agricultural sector for their livelihood. The three critical shifts. And while these three critical shifts have happened, one of the key matter for us to discuss and to debate and deliberate and to chart out a course of action for future is that how do we improve the livelihoods and improve the lives and the quality of living for the poorest of the poor who have been impacted by this pandemic. And this seminar is a step in that direction. World Vision India, through our programming in 120 districts in India, with a pan-India presence, with close to about 1,800 to 1,900 staff, boots on the ground, we were able to gauge, in some sense, what is the impact that was on the ground. In June 2020, when we did a rapid assessment on the impact of the COVID, when it was just hitting India, in June 2020, when we took the rapid assessment, 96% of the respondents said that their livelihoods were disrupted. But in March this year, when we have taken a evaluation of a baseline valuation of our programs and program areas, and covering close to about 20,000 respondents. And what was coming out is a very startling figure. Apart from the child health and maternal issues like stunting and wasting and underweight have drastically been reduced compared to 2019 when we have taken our last end line. Compared to that, if you look at that, it was drastically down. What was very startling to see is that the diet diversity among the households have been reduced from 73.80% who had a diet diversity is dropped to 35% in the last 1 year, between 2019 to 2021. From 73 to 35. The minimum meal frequency, people are having a minimum meals in 2019 in the areas where World Vision India was working was about 75% of them having a minimum meals. And that dropped to 26.67% in March 2021. And that is mainly because their livelihoods were disrupted. And a key components of these ones, of course, from the economic terms, is that they're having a lack of sufficient credit. And that dropped from 34% who used to have sufficient credit is dropped to 26%. Families having at least one member being in the saving group has dropped. Households where one or more adults are earning income has dropped. People who are having a secondary source of income has dropped. vulnerable families who are having an external support has dropped. While all these ones have created a lot of disruption, one of the key areas for us as a World Vision India, when we looked at livelihood and how do we improve and restore lives and livelihood, we felt that there are few important interventions that we should start looking at it and debating and then have a sense of direction. The 5 key areas where we, World Vision India, started to concentrate is to, number 1, how do we improve the access to the social safety net programs? It's important that people need to be part of that social safety net programs. Second one is to, how do we improve the diet diversity? Because that would in turn will improve mothers and children's health. We cannot attend to stunting, wasting, and underweight and the other child health related issues unless we address the diet diversity. The third one is to provide a financial support to restart non-farm businesses. So economic development activity assistance for something that we could provide to them. How do we provide that? In what form? And what are those entrepreneurial, social entrepreneurial, non-farm sectors that we can restart? The fourth one is that how do we provide financial support to a farm-based activities? And lastly, we can't forget that the government of India is also doing its job and creating various schemes and stimulus and the packages and financial help and financial packages. How do we link the beneficiaries to those packages? How do we become the last mile connectors so that most of those beneficiaries able to have, number 1, the awareness of it, access of it, and also availing those schemes? World Vision India is working in the most vulnerable households in India. And this webinar and the knowledge that gets shared will get translated into ensuring that our program quality is that much more strengthened so that we'll be able to reach out to those vulnerable households with better programming. And I sincerely hope that all of you would benefit from this sharing of knowledge and exchange of ideas, which will only going to make India a better country. Thank you so much. And without much ado, I would like to welcome our chief guest, Satoshi Sasaki-san. Thank you so much for gracing this occasion. Sasaki-san is a Deputy Director for International Labour Organization based out of Delhi. And I had this opportunity of having a very lovely interaction a few days back on the same similar subject. And he assumed this office in since 2018. And he has worked for ILO for over 24 years, progressing through specialized technical areas, enterprise development, entrepreneurial shape, local economic development, crisis response, and so on and so forth. He has an extensive experience of working with governments and international technical agencies and the UN. Apart from working in his home country, Japan, he has worked in various countries, including Solomon Islands, the Philippines, the Bangladesh, China, Thailand, and Fiji. He earned his BA from College of Liberal Arts, International Christian University in Tokyo. And also he earned his Master of Sciences in Economics, particularly from specializing in social development planning and management from the University of Wales in UK. He currently resides in New Delhi, India with his wife and son. And what a pleasure it is to invite Sasaki-san to deliver his keynote address as a chief guest. Over to Sasaki-san.
Thank you, Madhav, for your kind introduction, and very happy to see you online again. And the participants in the last meeting with your mother from the ILO for the found there are so many issues that we can work together with the world vision. This is why I'm here today as a chief guest of this meeting. Thank you very much. And I look forward to have more working at both the policy level as well as the implementation level at all over the country. So all the dignitaries, noted speakers, audience, namaste and good afternoon. It is my pleasure to join this important discussion on livelihood during the pandemic, challenges and opportunities. And I congratulate the organizer for their timely effort. The meaning insights shared on this platform by the recognized expert should effectively contribute towards the shaping the recovery from this pandemic. The ILO was among the first to identify that the COVID-19 is not just a medical crisis, but a social and economic one too. It has disturbed the economies and labor market globally. ILO has quick to respond to the fallout caused by this pandemic based on its 100 years of experience, which include dealing with previous emergencies and economic depressions. We regularly monitor the COVID-19 and world of work and periodically release estimates of the impact of income and employment. Besides, it also provides policy recommendations to deal with the situation under 4 pillars, which are to protect workers at the workplace, stimulate economic and labor demand, support employment and incomes, and use social dialogue between government, workers, and employers to find solutions. This policy response framework was carefully drafted, keeping in mind that global socio-economic diversity. It aimed at promoting inclusive and sustainable recovery from the pandemic. But I must mention that developing countries like India have to deal with a few unique challenges, such as high levels of informality with many workers working in precarious conditions and economic units, especially the micro and small units reporting low productivity. As a major setback during the pandemic, we also witnessed the tragic outflow of urban migrant laborers from cities back to villages. ILO's latest analysis on impact on labor supply due to COVID-19 containment measures in India shows that the lockdown measures directly affected 104 million informal workers. Without access to sufficient coverage of social protection and secure livelihood opportunities, these workers are on the verge of falling back into the poverty trap. That for the mother just was mentioned. ILO's rapid assessment of COVID-19 impact had earlier underlined that half of the country's women were outside the labor force, representing around 508 million women. Post-pandemic, they will face escalated challenges in returning to work. The crisis has affected quality of jobs and quantity of jobs and quality of employment. It has put already vulnerable groups who are also mostly engaged in the informal economy, such as migrant workers, women, youth, disabled people, tribal people, and economically weaker groups at further risks, depriving them of their livelihood. Enterprises in travel, tourism, hospitality, food service, retail and manufacturing sectors have been especially hard hit, with large portion of the workforce witnessing layoffs. For most enterprises, production disruptions permitted demand for many goods and services, which have forced them to suspend or scale down operations, with enormous impact on workers and employment. We have witnessed governments announcing fiscal and monetary measures to support the economy and enterprises. They are essential to ensure survival of businesses, to keep incomes and jobs protected. However, equal focus is needed on enabling social protection for all. Access to healthcare services and paid leave will provide sense of security and ensure effective work participation. We need a few more urgent and inclusive measures to improve the status of livelihood. Policies that promote micro-entrepreneurship and job creation need attention. For example, employment-intensive investment are needed in high-growth sectors. Green businesses need to be identified and developed for enabling decent work in such emerging areas. Local area development that promote local development and livelihood need to be encouraged. Policy and promote formalization of informal economy, incentivizing business to grow and to be sustainable and competitive. Low interest business loans and credit facilities are some of the approaches to ensure livelihood recovery. Investment in upskilling and reskilling of workers is essential. On priority, there is a need for capacitate people with digital and new age skills, including nurturing the innovation culture. We must implement our responses ensuring equity and inclusiveness. Our new formal should be responsive to the diverse needs of people and should integrate and address challenges related to gender, age, social origin, disability, or sexual orientation. This mainstreaming of issues and concerns of workers and businesses needs attention irrespective of nature of business or employment, whether formal or informal. Our recovery efforts from this pandemic needs to be derived from the process of social dialogue that should be rooted within globally accepted international labor standards, which have been developed with the consensus of the ILO tripartite constituents. Let me cite a few examples from the ILO responses in India. Through Start and Improve Your Business, or SIYB training, we have managed to train 10,000 youth, especially young women, during the pandemic to establish alternate source of income through entrepreneurship. Sustaining competitive and responsible businesses, or SCORE training, in partnership with Federation of India Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI, and corporate, is recently guiding more than 100 MSME suppliers on business continuity, quality and productivity management, which is helping them to ensure employee retention. Jointly with all India organization employers and FICCI, we also set up a help desk to support enterprises with registration processes and business continuity knowledge. In parallel, the ILO provides capacity building and training services to the cooperatives, collective and producers groups, enabling them to adjust to the new normal in the marketplace. Along with social partners, we support workers in informal economy, especially in the lower tiers of the supply chains, working in micro and home-based enterprises or home-based workers. We also work with the trade unions who identified, organized, and unionized home-based and informal workers, provided training on alternate skills, and enable access to the government COVID relief packages and social security schemes. As a way forward, our effort needs to be embedded within the decent work agenda as enshrined in Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the number 8 of it. It calls for collective efforts and not a one-sided government or worker or business response alone. We need a public-private partnership, not just at the national level, but also at the global level as well. Recently, government, workers, and employers delegates from ILO member states have anonymously adopted a global call to action for human-centered COVID-19 recovery that prioritized the creation of decent jobs for all and addressed the inequalities caused by the crisis. To do this, we need innovative approaches, including harnessing digital technology and infrastructure, green technology, and new ways of learning, while ensuring that we leave no one behind when it comes to the generating livelihood during the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, COVID is not only a health issue, but also social and economic ones as well. While medical workers are making their best effort to protect people from coronavirus, we must do more on the social and economics, the aspects. This is why we are here today. I thank you again, World Vision, for this opportunity for the ILO to share our views. Thank you, audience, to your patience to listen to my words. I look forward to a fruitful discussion ahead. Thank you and namaste.
Thank you, Satoshi Sasaki-san. And it is wonderful to hear from you and particularly the perspectives from an international organization such as international labor organizations. It's important for us to see a perspective how whether the policy changes, whether it's in terms of the international organizations stand and some of the remedial measures that have been recommended by the ILO to the various policymakers, and it is very, very good to hear from you. And our next guest, special guest, is Dr. Sachitanda Shukla, and he is a chief economist of the Mahindra Group. He has over 20 years of experience spanning capital markets and financial services. Prior to joining Mahindra Group, he was associated with Access Capital as chief economist. His key areas of research have been financial markets, strategy, development policy, program implementation, and impact evaluation. And all is sounding very, very music to my ears, Dr. Sachitanda Shukla. And he has a PhD in financial economics from Birla Institute of Technology and a postgraduate qualification in business management with a specialization in finance, as well as in economics from University of Mumbai. And he has been the recipient of KJ Soumya Gold Medal. He's currently a part of Niti Aayog's panel of economists and has been part of Planning Commission in World Bank study Maharashtra Development Report as an external expert. He's keenly associated with academia and is member of board of Soumya Vidya Vihar University in Mumbai, and has also authored a book on macroeconomics for BMS course of University of Mumbai. Dr. Shukla is currently a co-chair of FICCI's Economics Committee and a chairperson of the Banking, Finance and Economics Committee of the Bombay Chamber Bombay Chamber. He is also associated with the Economics Committee, Western Region of Confederation of Indian Industry. It is such an honor, Dr. Sachitanda Shukla, to have you to share with us an economist's perspective on lives and livelihood and the disruption caused by the COVID pandemic. Over to you, Dr. Shukla.
Thank you, Dr. Madhav, for that introduction. Thank you, World Vision, for having me over. distinguished guests and experts. Over the next 8 to 10 minutes, I will be trying to take you through the economic environment as we see it from a macroeconomic perspective. I will try and highlight some of the key issues that the pandemic has wrought upon us. I think one of the most important things that we notice is that while the pandemic has impacted all of us in several ways, from a macroeconomic standpoint, it has also impaired our ability to collect data and understand some of the vital macroeconomic variables. For example, GDP growth, employment, and inflation, right? Which there is a lot of talk about. So may I request these slides to be put up, please? I will be using the crutches of these slides, and I think some people in the audience have spoken about the use of slides. Dr. Neil, could we have those slides, please? Right. I hope everybody is able to see these slides, and also the audio is clear.
Yes, Dr. Shukla.
So I think if you look at this picture, I think this is the summary of what I'm going to be talking about today. This is the key message. While we all have been hit by this pandemic, which is the same storm, each segment, each country, each business, each industry, each individual has been impacted very, very differently. And I think that is the essence of the message that I'm trying to get at. Can we move on? Yes, thank you so much. So just trying to highlight some of the divergences that we see because of this pandemic. Just look at the vaccination divergence across rich and poor countries. Just look at the top, which is Canada, and just go down all the way to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa. Essentially, about 46% of the population in higher income economies has been fully vaccinated versus less than 10% in poor economies. Now, let me give you one more stat. About 5 billion doses have been administered the world over, which is a decent number in the fight against COVID. And at least 1/3 of the total population has got at least one dose across the world. But now let me point out a stark fact. Only 0.3%, 0.3% doses have been administered in 27 of the poorest economies in the world. So while this slide, we are talking about more than 46% of the population in high income and less than 10% in poor economies. If I were to talk about only the 27 poorest economies in the world, only 0.3% have gotten their first doses, which essentially means less than 2 million people have been given at least one dose. So that just tells you the vast difference or the divergence that we are seeing in vaccination itself, which is going to be the biggest, say, bulwark of the recovery process. Next, please. And what this vaccination is doing is accentuating the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. If you look at the left-hand side, just look at 2020. And on the right, you have 2021 numbers. Just look at this blue bar, which has been circled, 7%. No, that's not some emerging economy. That is the United States of America, right? Growing at 7%. Now, when was the last time any one of us saw an economy as large as the US growing at 7%? It's a humongous number put in context of the size of the economies. Similarly, if you move on to the extreme right, the 2020 and 2021 average, just look at the way these economies are growing. US growing at 1.8, which is the left-hand side bar. And the biggest building that you see over there, the biggest star, 5.2%, is actually China. If we take out China, the emerging countries are not doing so well. So the growth recovery is a function of the pace of vaccination and the containment of the virus. And second is the kind of money that has been thrown at the problem, where the advanced economies are on a much better footing, and that is reflecting in a faster growth recovery. Next, please. Look at India, for example. The left-hand side is the active COVID cases, and we've seen how the second wave overwhelmed the country. The numbers have come down, but have started to go up back again. I mean, we are seeing large numbers coming out of the state of Kerala, and India is going to enter into the festive season from here on. And therefore, there are signs of worry. But I mean, some solace. The number of doses administered have picked up pace. I mean, the right-hand side chart you can see. And one of these days last week, we actually managed to get about 1 crore in terms of single-day vaccination, which is a benchmark. I think that is a number India will require to really vaccinate the entire population. Next, please. Now the crux of the argument. If you boil it down to the GDP growth estimates, just look at the red worm, the red line. Even after the second wave, you can see that the GDP growth estimates for FY22 have not come down dramatically. They are hovering around 9.5%. So just look at from 4th of December, when most forecasters were talking about 9.4%. We have seen this number go up as high as say 10.9. But even after the second wave, as we speak in August, or even back in June, the number was at 9.5%. Now, this is very unlike last year, which is the black line. People kept cutting their GDP estimates throughout the year. And this number, this steady number of 9.5% actually hides a lot more than it reveals. I just want to tell people here, the way the GDP estimates are made, it is essentially an extrapolation of several components of GDP. For example, the quarterly value add, right, which is a 2-digit level number. I don't want to bore you with statistics and boring technical details. But essentially, if you look at, say, the industry or the manufacturing number, what is done is you look at the previous quarter number and extrapolate based on that using formal data sets, right? I think this is something that we must be really aware of. We don't really count the unorganized sector very well. I mean, the data capture is very, very poor. And India has about 45% unorganized sector, which is not really represented very well in the GDP. A lot of these extrapolations are made using formal sector data sets. So, for example, you have some of these housing companies or construction companies. What is done? I'm just talking about, giving a very simplistic, say, representation of what really happens, what goes into the GDP. So, if you look at that construction segment, which is 8 to 9% of GDP, a few companies' results are taken, and then that is extrapolated as the number for the entire segment. But we know that 55 to 60% of that segment is unorganized. So the point I'm making is the data that you will continue to see in GDP will not capture the pain of the MSMEs, of the rural economy, of the unorganized sector, simply because the COVID has actually impaired our ability further to be able to collect data on growth, on inflation, on jobs. And similarly, the interpretation really becomes really, really difficult. So this is something that I want everybody to know and understand, that even with a 9.5% growth number, we are not anywhere close to where we should have been given the kind of population, given the kind of aspirations we have in India. Next, please. So this is the basic point. The other key message that I wanted to deliver. This is going to be a multi-speed recovery. And then if we can move forward, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So if I were to look at the various components, sectors, segments of the GDP, look at agriculture, look at industry, look at services. Services still struggling really. Industry has more or less come back to where it was. So the GDP number, which is an average, really hides a lot of these deviations in the economy. Next, please. Another way to look at the growth is private consumption, the top left line chart, investment demand, government consumption, and exports. You can see all of these lines indicating a slightly V-shaped sort of recovery. And what it means essentially is, if you, next please. So if I were to now put everything in perspective using just say automobile sales, and I use a 3-month moving average, even with a good, robust YY numbers, right? Car sales, passenger car sales, we will be where we were in September 2013, right? If I were to look at two-wheelers, India will be, I mean, given the numbers using these 3-month moving average, the number would be close to where we were in May 2010. Look at CVs, we would be closer to where we were in September 2009. And the three-wheeler is actually literally off the chart. We haven't seen this low a number in our, say, recorded history. So this is how the average number really doesn't give you the right picture. It hides more than it reveals. Next, please. This is the basic point that I want everybody to understand. Basically, the level of GDP output, we are more or less going to be at the same place where we were even with a 9% number. So 9% sort of looks fantastic, but essentially just look at the FY20 bar and the FY22 bar. These are more or less where we were in. So we will be producing almost the same output in terms of goods and services as we did in 2020, even after 8 consecutive quarters. Next, please. And there are divergences and divergences. Look at manufacturing versus services, right? The blue line is manufacturing. There is a huge divergence, and it has implications for jobs in India because services, a lot of these contact services are host to bulk of the jobs that India has in the unorganized segment. And this lag will really impact that. Next, please. Look at, I've tried to break the IIP index in labor intensive versus capital intensive. Just look at the way the gap has more than doubled. So the average gap was about 15-20%. Now this is more than double in terms of impact. So COVID is impacting labor sensitive sectors a lot more than the capital intensive ones. Next, please. And just look at this. This is very, very interesting, intriguing. Left-hand side, you see consumer sentiments are down in the dumps. I mean, just keeps on going down, whereas business sentiments have bounced back. So businesses are more optimistic than the consumers who have been impacted because of income hit. Dr. Satoshi Sasaki spoke about how it has impacted various segments of the economy. So I'll not talk about it, but essentially, you can see it in the consumer psyche, in the consumer sentiments. Next, please. Another interesting thing, we saw the rural areas getting impacted by the pandemic significantly harder this time. And what has happened is, just look at those 2 circles on the right side. Once the pandemic hit, rural sentiments actually nosedived, but they have recovered much faster than the urban sentiments, right? Which is very, very interesting. I mean, we all thought that with the kind of numbers, with the kind of catastrophe that we saw in terms of human lives lost, we thought rural was going to be in doldrums, but rural sentiments have actually outpaced the urban sentiments, which is a big conundrum. Next, please. Another thing, I mean, I've tried to proxy the rural versus urban incomes. The blue line is the rural deposits. Just look at the way people have drawn down on their savings, right? Continuously from March 20 onwards, they have kept on withdrawing their savings because of the impact of the pandemic. So this is not a recent phenomenon, not a second wave phenomenon. Actually, this is a COVID phenomenon because it started from the first wave itself. People started to withdraw their savings, whereas if you look at the urban areas, the green line, it has kept on going up because people have benefited from forced savings. A lot of these people are locked into their homes and they're not having the same, say, ability to go out and consume these services or spend on durables, etc. So there is a stark say, difference that you can see, and this will manifest in different ways in terms of consumption going forward. Next, please. Another example is just look at these numbers. I have just given you AUMs of portfolio managers, which is the yellow bar, and mutual fund AUMs of high net worth individuals. Now, this number of, say, the AUM is of only about 1.27 lakh people, right? 1.3 lakh people. And the green bar, which is about 88 lakh folios, which means accounts, mutual fund accounts. One person can have multiple accounts, so this does not necessarily mean 88 lakh people. Basically, this small set of people have benefited by their AUMs going up by 5 lakh crore in just one single year, right? So this is the kind of dichotomy that we are seeing in the economy, and it is going to manifest in the difference between the haves and have-nots. This is just a stark example of how some people have been, say, rendered better, whereas some of the rest have been rendered worse off. I think this is something that makes it very clear how the K-shaped recovery is actually panning out in the economy. This will have implications for MSMEs. This will have implications for the rural economy. This will have implications for jobs growth, and this will leave a scar on the economy going forward. It will take a long time for the unorganized sector to really come out of this. Next, please. Yeah. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you so much. I hope I finished in time. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. I think that was a crash course on the economics and to see from an economic point of view, particularly from a macroeconomic point of view, and the drivers and all that. As you rightly pointed out, the difference between the haves and have-nots are going to be even more starker than ever before because of the pandemic. And the Gini coefficient, I'm sure, would have been much more worse if you really take a dip test of a Gini coefficient today. And as all the pointers and the data that shows. And another important aspect which you have rightly covered, during the pandemic, if everybody would have, a common man would have expected the Bombay Stock Exchange to crash because the companies would have not been making profits. But when you really look at in terms of the PE ratios of some of the companies growing up, and because the market sentiment is that the companies would make profits on the back end of the cost recoveries that have been done due to the salaries, rents, and various other operational costs. While the consumer sentiment has been stayed a little lower, but companies have made profits on the back end of the cost efficiency measures, and people have made sure that people put their bets on the market, seeing the profits, and we can see that the stark reality there. But I'm sure, as you rightly said, as the days go by, it will start to bite us a little harder. And as the quarter-on-quarter results start to throw up, the number of job losses to the consumer sentiment to recover back again. And hopefully, if the inflation continues to stay lower, and most of the people tend to stay at least above their heads, above the water. But you have thrown a lot of questions at the same time and challenges, and for our development sector organization like World Vision India, and these one are something that we have to take into account when we draw development strategies. And thank you so much, Dr. Shukla, for your very, very valuable suggestion. Over to Dr. James Neil Devasahayam, our head of technical programs. Over to Neil. And I think you are facing the camera on the other side. I think you need to face the camera towards this side, Neil. And thank you. And over to Dr. Neil to take us through the next part of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhav, for introducing the two speakers and also giving the macro view of the country. Really, we have seen that the employment in terms of during the pandemic has drastically gone down, and that has a great impact on the household level. And in terms of the macro view, what Dr. Shukla has presented, it's really the demand even for the car and other automobiles industries, where way back we are going back before 5 to 7 years back. So that means if these industries is not functioning properly, the employment also correspondingly, we get the less employment at the lower end. So every industrial growth has its contribution, labor contribution at the point of the labor and creating employment. Thank you for the two session. It's really giving a macro picture. And now I just request, before going to the technical session, we will have the community voice. I request to play a 2 minutes video. I request Hasim to play the video.
कोविड-19 के चलते हुए हम लोग को बहुत सारी समस्याओं का सामना करना पड़ा, जिससे हम लोग खेत नहीं जा पा रहे थे, क्योंकि लॉकडाउन लगा हुआ था। उस चक्कर में हम लोग खेत जाने में भी परेशानी हुई थी।
मेरे पास कुछ भी कमाने का साधन नहीं था, तो वर्ल्ड विजन की तरफ से मुझे लॉकडाउन में मशीन मिली, जिससे मैं दूसरों को सिलाई सिखाने लगी और उससे मैं दूसरों के कपड़े भी सिलती हूँ, जिससे मेरे पास पैसे कमाने का साधन हो गया है।
वर्ल्ड विजन से मुझे कॉस्मेटिक का सामान सब भी मिला था, जिसको बेचकर मुझे बहुत फ़ायदा हुआ है, क्योंकि उससे मुझे अपना घर चलाने में भी बहुत मदद मिला है। मैं उससे अपना बच्चों का फीस भी जमा कर पाती हूँ और छोटा मोटा ज़रूरत भी पूरा कर सकती हूँ।
वर्ल्ड विजन के माध्यम से हम लोग को कोविड की
Thank you. Actually, we have now seen the some of the economic interventions where our community has benefited. And before going into the technical session, I just briefly highlight one or two aspects, and then we'll move to the technical session. So, in terms of our country having more than 1.3 billion people, if you look at that, the highest share of workers are under the informal category. And the suspension of work really pushed them without employment and without no income. So in terms of, if you look at the statistics in the unemployment, it touched about 14.7 during the third week of May, which is recently. So the unemployment is still picking at a high rate. And in terms of the people, those who are sleep into the national minimum wage poverty line, that's about 2.6 million. And really the pandemic highlighted the precarity of the endemic to the lives and livelihoods of the informal sector. So this is one side. We talk about the negative aspect or the difficult phase of the one side. The other side, we have also some of the sectors have really coped with and really improved. One such sector is agriculture sector. So we have seen many reports, even World Bank report on agriculture. We have seen that agriculture became a very highly resilient sector, and most of the people, those who have come out of the factory employment, they have the only sector to fall back is agriculture sector. So that is one positive aspect we look at in the pandemic situation. The other thing is government has promoted, released a lot of funds under Bharat Atma Nirman Yojana, where, and also the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana. So a lot of funds have been floated in terms of more than 20 crores at the 20 lakhs crores in the first phase, and the later also increasing the number of days of Narega program. So that gives a lot of little cushion to manage the pandemic situations. And in between, a lot of corporates also have contributed towards a lot of donations in terms of to the hospital, in terms of beds, extra beds arrangement, whatever the oxygen cylinders that needed. Those kind of things, the corporate has also contributed a lot. And the MSME really play a vital role in giving employment to more than 120 million people in our country. That is very, very notable. But that is the only sector is not badly affected, by which the total 120 million worker is almost out of the job. And we have seen a lot of innovations also. A lot of states have come out with the cash transfer programs during the time, especially one example in Tamil Nadu, where the cash transfer has been done through the PDS system, public distribution system. That's really, it's a very innovative way many states have demonstrated to support at the time of crisis. So these are some of the things we have looked at, the challenges on one side and the efforts of the government on the other side, and also how the agriculture became a resilient sector is the other side also we see as a progressive aspect of it. Now we will just go into the technical session. The technical session, we have about 3 thematic areas. One is about the employment and income loss and its recovery and linkages to economic stimulus packages. So how the economic loss and how we can just connect to the economic stimulus packages that is announced by the government. That is one thematic area we look at. The second one, we look at workers at the time of COVID. In terms of workers without no security, without workers without no welfare schemes, how the real struggles are and what measures that we can take it up in terms of social security and entitlement. This is our second topic. And the third one is what world vision we just doing the rapid assessment and how we have designed a program, how we have specifically help those people through our 110 development program. So these are the thematic 3 themes we have just planned. I now invite Dr. Rosa Abraham to take over the first session on employment and income. A brief note on Dr. Rosa Abraham. She is a senior research fellow at the Center of Sustainable Employment in Azim Premji University. Her research has focused on forms of informal labor in India and examining the rise of informalization in the formal and unorganized sector, and also its consequences on the impact, both on productivity and also the inequality. So that is also she has her studies she is focusing. The other aspect is also she is an author and contributor to the annual State of Working India reports that every year the CSE, the Center for Sustainable Employment, publishes every year. She is also a contributor to that particular report. We have seen the report and it was released in May. That was a very comprehensive one. And her interest includes labor and development economics, particularly the issue related to women's work, measurement of work, and the changing nature of informal work. So I welcome Dr. Rosa Abraham for this particular session, and over to her for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. James. If we can just go to the slides. I just want to thank Dr. James and the team at World Vision India for the invitation and the opportunity to participate and speak about our work at the center. It's also been great listening to the earlier speakers, and I've learned a lot. So thank you once again for this opportunity. So my work draws largely from the State of Working India report that was released in May. And this is work done alongside my colleagues here at the university, including Dr. Amit Pasole, Surbi Kesar, Mrinal Nija, and Rahul Nahuti. So this is sort of joint credit to all of them. In this presentation, I will specifically be looking at the formal workforce in India. And so I think there's been a lot of attention, and rightly so, on India's informal workforce. On the one hand, they contribute to the largest share of employment in the economy, and they are also likely to be the most vulnerable to such a large shock like the pandemic. But I thought it was also pertinent to look at this formal salaried workforce because they have received far less attention. And this is also the sort of aspirational workforce. This is a share of the sector, employment sector that's grown steadily over the last few years. And it was to our credit that we have been able to gradually grow our salaried work. And I wanted to then see how have these workers fared, given that they are sort of in a way better off in terms of their employment status pre-pandemic. How did they face the pandemic? And as Dr. Shukla pointed out, this was one storm, but there are many boats. And the formal workforce in that sense is a completely different boat, both in terms of how they've been impacted, as well as what is the kind of recovery that they would, stimulus that they would need. So in my presentation, I just want to clarify that it focuses largely on this salaried formal workforce. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so just, I don't think I need to spend too much time on it. What I will point out, however, is that for most of this presentation, it is derived largely from the panel data that emerges from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy's data set. Of course, this has come under the radar recently, and I'm happy to engage in that discussion in the Q&A. But for now, we're going to take this as sort of the data that gives us the evidence. Also, because that really was the only sort of data available throughout the pandemic, both before the pandemic and after the pandemic as well. Next slide, please. So one thing that is, it's now common knowledge is that as a result of the pandemic and the huge employment shock that India landed up in, there was an increase in informal employment, right? So when you talk about informal employment, this is employment without a contract, employment without paid leave, employment without access to basic entitlements like gratuity or insurance and so on. Now, this graph, again, one more qualifier before I proceed is that I'm a quantitative economist. So a lot of my message will be conveyed largely through data. I'm sorry, but I will try and make it as self-explanatory and as easy to interpret as possible. So if you look at this, this is a sort of a transition graph. On the left-hand side is basically the different kinds of employment in 2019. And this is DW stands for daily wage work. So these are our, casual workers who are sort of hired for a few weeks or for a few months. Their wage rate is constantly negotiated. So that's about a quarter of the economy. Then you have SC, which is self-employment. TS is temporary salaried work. And PS is permanent salaried work. So think of this PS as what is of interest to us and what I'll be talking about in this presentation. And on the right-hand side is where these workers landed up a year later after the pandemic, at the end of 2020, what were the kinds of work that they were doing. Now, bring your attention to the PS bar right at the end, again, because this is what is of interest here. If you look at PS, what you see is that about 50% of permanent salaried workers, or specifically 48%, is able to remain as permanent salaried through the course of that year. So that's your large pink bar at the end. But at the same time, what you see is a large, although smaller bar, but still a substantial amount, about 30% of permanent salaried workers who have now transitioned into self-employment. And then you have smaller shares transitioning into daily wage work as well as temporary salaried work. So broadly, about half of the workforce who were previously in salaried, aspirational, professional employment had now moved out of that and were now navigating in different kinds of informal, low-paid, precarious kinds of work. So that is one immediate impact that the formal workforce faced as a result of the lockdown. And this was, a few months after the lockdown. This data is for August, September, October, November, December. So several months after the lockdown, they still continued to remain in other kinds of informal work, right? And now if you come to the next slide, what you see is this transition into informality, or rather the movement in the permanent salaried work is not the same depending on where you start at. If you look at different classes of workers. Can we please move to the next slide? Thank you. Right, so now what I've done is looked at the permanent salaried workers, but I've divided them into different quintiles. So quintile 1 is basically those 25% of permanent salaried workers who were at the lowest in terms of their wages. So the poorest permanent salaried workers are in quintile 1, and the richest permanent salaried workers are in quintile 4. So now let's look at quintile 1, and as you can see here, what's happening is that about 31% of your permanent salaried workers in the lowest quintile, or the poorest permanent salaried workers, were forced to just exit the labor market, right? So they lost their jobs and they were not able to come back to work, and they had to completely exit. Now the share in the richer permanent salaried workers who had to exit is much smaller. It's only about 8%, right? About 62% or 63% of the rich permanent salaried workers were able to stay permanent salaried, and they were able to remain at work. So the immediate disparity that you see here is that the massive informalization, as well as the exit from the labor force that you see, is heavily loaded amongst the poorer permanent salaried workers. So now, as again Dr. Shukla had pointed out, there's a huge inequality that has come, and this is not something that exists just as your daily wage workers are now earning less, and so they are poorer. The rich who have these mutual funds that have huge increase in profits. But at the same time, you have this middle class who were teachers, doctors, nurses, who are now, depending on where they were to begin with, they've been really pushed down even further at the end of the pandemic. So there is a sort of very class-based disparities amongst the permanent salaried workers. Can we come to the next slide? Now this graph, I just want you to focus your attention on the circles on the right-hand side of the graph. So PP, PS, PT, and PD. Now what this graph is showing on the x-axis is basically how much did a worker earn pre-pandemic, and on the y-axis is how much they earned post-pandemic. Now, if you earned the same in both pre and post, you're on a 45-degree line. You're on that line because you've earned the same amount in both periods. Now, what you see is most workers or most groups of workers have earned less, right? Now, how much they earn, by how much their earnings fall, really depends on what is the transition, what do they change into, right? So your P2P is basically people who remained permanent salaried in both periods, pre and post pandemic. And as you can see, there's not much difference. There's not much fall in their earnings. They were earning about 35,000 in the beginning of the year, and beginning pre-pandemic, and by post-pandemic, again, around that much, though slightly smaller. But then if you come to your P2S, these are folks who were permanent salaried and now have become self-employed, right? So they were initially earning about 30,000, and their earnings have now fallen to about 17,000 per month. Okay, so that's almost a halving of their earnings. Similarly, you see a much higher fall when you move from permanent salaried to temporary salaried, so your P to T. And you also see a much larger fall when you move from P to D. So if you go to the next slide, we will see the actual numbers associated with this. So somebody who remained permanent salaried throughout these two periods faced an income loss of about 10%. And when you move to other kinds of work, your income effectively reduces by about 50%. And as I showed earlier, this movement into other kinds of work is also very heterogeneous. So you have folks who are actually at the lower end of permanent salaried work, so less paid permanent salaried workers. Their movement options are far fewer. So their ability to go into, say, self-employment, which is actually slightly better paid than daily wage work, is very restricted. And so it is also then likely that the fall in income is also larger for salaried workers who were in any way poorer to begin with, right? So on the one hand, you have the loss of employment is more likely for poorer permanent salaried workers, and then the loss in earnings is also higher for those who are at the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to permanent salaried earnings, right? Now, if you come to the next slide, I just want to sort of give a flavor of what this means. So, like I said, there's heterogeneous experiences within the formal workers, and I just wanted to take two kinds of very prominent for different reasons, for prominent occupations. So on the one hand, let's look at teachers. So teachers between 2020 and 2021, and in fact, this is more recent data. This is actually in 2021, beginning of the year. What we find is about 35% of teachers were able to remain as teachers. So they were teaching pre-pandemic, only 35% were now remaining as teachers. And instead, what happens is half of teachers have now moved to daily wage work or small scale petty self-employment. So schools have shut, small private schools have not been able to function. They may not have been able to meet the digitization requirements. As a result, there's massive layoff of teachers, and about half of them, and again, you'll see that about these numbers, that number should be 14%. 14% actually withdrew from the workforce entirely. And for the remaining 50%, this is a movement into other kinds of informal activities. On the other hand, if you look at IT professionals, which is again a very visible sector in India's formal workforce, and they're at the other end of the spectrum, right? They're well paid and in fact, what you think is very secure jobs. The contrast is very stark here. This should be 67% of IT professionals remained as IT professionals or remained as permanent salaried workers. They were able to hold on to their jobs, their security of the employment is more or less guaranteed. About 20% had to move into self-employment, and again, 14% withdrew from the workforce. So here, the contrast is very stark here, right? So you have both of these are permanent salaried. These are regular salaried workers, but their vulnerabilities are actually very, very different. And so this then to build on this thing that the experience A has been very different for salaried workers, and B, within salaried workers, there is a variety of variation in the experience. Then we need to think about what is it that the recovery policy needs to focus on to sort of revive this employment. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right. So one thing that, as I said before, is that it's been a very heterogeneous experience. And what we find is that this heterogeneity is really stark when we look at it in terms of gender. So women are most likely, amongst the teachers, most of them are likely to be women, and they have been, disproportionately affected in terms of job loss. Women were 7 times more likely to lose jobs compared to men, 11 times less likely to actually come back to work compared to men. This is something that we showed in the SWI, and this particularly applies also because women are in industries that are high touch, that are sort of particularly vulnerable because of the nature of the pandemic. So women have been disproportionately affected. Young workers, again, have been very highly, disproportionately affected. They've not been able to come back into work. And the other aspect that we find is that caste has also made things worse. So for many workers, what we see is that suppose you lose your job as a security guard, or in the formal sector. So you're in a sense a salaried worker. You may have lost that job, but then you're able to come back into farm work. You're able to cultivate your land. So agriculture was an important fallback sector for many workers, particularly in the salaried work, particularly in rural areas. Right, but then the moment the access to land is also so unequal, then also the potential and the possibility for recovery also then becomes extremely unequal as well. So those caste groups, as well as those religious minorities that may not have access to land compared to other religious groups, then are particularly, devastatingly affected because they don't even have the fallback option of going into agriculture. So recovery policy in that sense need to focus on promoting jobs in general and specifically for marginalized groups. So in the context of the formal workforce, how do you sort of revive formal growth, especially given the high increase in informality? One sort of welcome move by the government has been the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana, under which the EPF payment, which employers have to make, so they have to match the employee's contribution to the Provident Fund. Under this scheme, the government has been paying the employer's share of it. So in effect, this is like a wage subsidy for formal registered enterprises. And it's also in that sense catalyzing formal work. So if you have an employee and you are paying them PF, then you can actually get subsidy from the government. So this needs to continue, and it's a one way in which you can get wage subsidies. There are other state governments have previously experimented with things like wage subsidies to actually promote formal employment. So that is something that can actually catalyze the recreation of formal work. And in that sense too, it can actually target specific groups of people. So if you create jobs for women, if you're hiring a woman as a formal worker in your enterprise, then in particular that can get a special treatment under these kind of programs, so that these heterogeneity in the impact can also be addressed through the policy. And what we also see so far in terms of recovery policy is that it has largely been oriented towards the infrastructure sector, to construction, and also it has largely been credit oriented. And in that sense, I would argue that both of these focus does not necessarily meet the goals of targeted employment creation. So on the one hand, infrastructure, the construction sector is very male oriented. It's again promoting informal work. To the extent that it is able to provide that informal work, it is a welcome catalyst, but it has its limitations in terms of the quality of work that it can generate, right? So policy needs to look beyond just these infrastructure orientation and also just through credit orientation, because as you can see, despite the huge boost that has been given to credit, many enterprises have simply been sitting on their hands when it comes to utilizing many of these sort of SOPs that the governments have given. So policy needs to look beyond a mere infrastructure / credit orientation. And in this context, what we at the center have been arguing for and kind of talking about even pre-pandemic, and actually has been this focus on universal basic services. Now, what are these universal basic services? This is basically health and education to begin with. So this is government investment in public services towards health and public services for education. And why is this particularly important now? So historically, health and education have been tremendously underinvested in the Indian context. But in the specific context of the pandemic, these are two sectors that have been crucial. Health, as you know, is an important sector, right? And given that this is a health crisis in many ways, and we see how important it has been to have our primary health centers, have our Anganwadi workers, have functioning public health services, how important that has been in meeting the demands of the crisis. And given the huge vaccination demands that lie ahead, there is scope to invest in this sector, which can have multiplier effects. Similarly, we are heading to huge educational deficits into the future. We have children, particularly younger age children, who have been out of school for nearly 2 years now. And there's going to be, thank you, I'm concluding in a minute. So there's going to be huge educational deficits. So here too, there is massive job creation potential. So we had estimated even pre-pandemic, just filling vacancies and meeting current vacancies in both health and education can create 15 million jobs. And these are 15 million good jobs. These are decent jobs. And these are also jobs that can cater to these marginalized communities, particularly women. And more than that, by providing the health and education infrastructure and by catering to these needs, you can also push these kind of communities and vulnerable groups back into the workforce. Set up your Anganwadis, set up your creches so women can work there, other women can also go back into the workforce. So we argue that the universal basic services is an important scheme that the government needs to focus on to revive formal sector work as well as to revive demand that can then have multiplier effects. So I want to conclude here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa Abraham, for highlighting the key aspects about the transition, how even the permanent, salaried workers, they have shifted to various, transited into various aspects, even pushed out of the job. So that is very evident in your presentation. And also inequality is, is a major one that is a huge issue that is also you have highlighted. And in terms of permanent worker, even from the IT sector or the schools, they also just pushed out or they have taken up some of the smaller jobs. So that's workers transition in the formal kind of job they have moved in. So that is one aspect. And in terms of the recovery aspect of it, or the reviving of these whole situations, you have highlighted how to really to create employment, and then the employment also how it could be secured with the PF and other package benefits, so that they will have a kind of social security in hand. Time like this, they can just fall back. So those kind of options you have given, and the universalization of the services, that really helps them. If any future such occurrence really helps us to bounce back in those areas. Really, that's a very, very valuable input for us and all those who are listening. Thank you, Dr. Abraham, for your presentation. Thank you very much. And now the next topic that we are moving into is workers at the time of COVID and social security and entitlements. This is again, it's we have seen at the time of the pandemic, when it's lockdown started. We know the agony and the challenges of workers. So one of the things what we look at, how the social security and the entitlement that we need to ensure that that's a big focus on this particular session. I will now invite Smita Kanija, who is working in the Action Aid India NGO, to share the presentation. A brief note about Smita. She is a gender and a human rights advocate working in development sector for more than 17 years. She has cross-thematic work experience with the excluded community, particularly focusing on the issue of labor livelihood and the intersectionalities of these aspects with gender and caste. She has been working closely with social movements, networks, and other civil spaces and organizations. Her core competencies include the strategic campaigning on public policies, programs, and development, and the stakeholder engagement, and also formation of various coalitions and formation of various alliances for making a collective effort to advocate on the issues of the people, those who are totally excluded. I just now invite Smita Kanija to take over and make the presentation.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you to World Vision team members for inviting me to this webinar. I'll take over from where perhaps Dr. Rosa has left, and she made a call, a very emphatic and very pushy call on universalization of basic services. And I was reading in the comments, Vimlaji has said that yes, there should be sanitation, housing, and every other aspect which also needs to be included as part of basic services. I do agree with you, Vimla, there. So I'll share a little bit background about our work here with informal workers, and then we'll go to the formal slide presentations. So ActionAid works across 24 states, and we primarily work on with the informal workers in these states. We work our work is not very monolithic in terms of just looking at the nature of work, but also looking at caste dimensions, looking at other challenges which the workers are facing. Am I audible? I just want to cross check.
Yes, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Thanks. So
Please request to mute.
Okay, so in that time and space where ActionAid was engaged in these states, and we were working on the rights and entitlements of poor and marginalized communities, the pandemic struck last year, and that's when there was an internal churning process within the organization, and we received frantic calls of support from dry ration support health support in the second wave. And all that led us to, not only document cases of, how COVID had impacted this sector, but also to look at and understand deeply what it meant, what situations like these mean for informal workers. And here I would like to say, by government's own admission, there are roughly around 38 crores informal workers in India. And this is a very recent figures which they came out when they launched the e-Shram portal for recording, creating a database of informal workers. Now, definitely we all agree to one thing, that how COVID has impacted the livelihood, the wages, the saving, the consumptions, and the social, security and basic services which were available to informal workers. We initiated a longitudinal study last year around May, and with the informal workers, and we, by virtue of, a longitudinal study means a study in which we reach out to X number of workers over a period of say 3 months, 6 months, and then again go back to 6 months. And we identified in our first round itself, some 11,530 workers across 21 states, and in these states it includes 293 source and 393 destination districts. It's very important here to state these figures, because these workers are not again a very uniform or a homogeneous category, but these workers were migrant in nature. And mind you, these were the workers who were walking the national highways at that point of time because of lack of transport. And we reached out to these workers through our networks, through our fellows, through our partners support. So a big thank you there to all of them. And the study highlighted that there has been a tremendous loss of livelihood, roughly around 78% in terms of indebtedness. 53% said that they had taken some or the other kind of loan, and more than half said that they were stranded at places where they were for more than a month. And of course they had to 3/5 of them said that they had to vacate their housings during the lockdown period because they were not able to pay rentals. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and then after May, we went ahead, because it's a longitudinal study, to do a second round of survey, which is post the lockdown, and that is sometime in August, towards August 10 and September beginning. And here you may have noticed that there was no such so-called wave around, and there was a lot of talk and euphoria that COVID is not impacting India at that particular point of time. And this time we reached out to close to 17,000 informal workers. Around 402 districts were covered in 23 states and 5 union territories. And out of these 16, roughly 17,000 workers, 4,818 workers were the ones whom we had reached in the first round itself. So this idea of going back to the first round workers was also this, so that we kind of draw a comparative which is there. And in terms of respondents, as ActionAid works with most marginalized groups, we had roughly 40% of the sample was from scheduled caste, 26% were from backward classes, and 18% were from tribals, and 15% included other categories, including persons with disability. And even we had 0.1% who identified themselves as transgender or had withheld their gender identity. And at that point of time, there were certain natural disasters. There was Amphan, which had struck the eastern coast. So all those factors were also counted in when we were recording these interviews with informal workers. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's look at a comparative. What happens when a lockdown is there, and what happens when a lockdown is open? And we realized that while unemployment had reduced from 78% to 48%, but in terms of wages, 64% had not received any wages since lockdown, which was a up. Now, if you look at, in terms of savings were, roughly around down from 95% in the round one to 88%. In terms of, support which the informal workers got through PDS, they of course, because by the time the governments, the state governments especially, were a little prepped So there, something which was reported as, only 45% outreach was roughly around 79% there. In terms of, water sufficiency, again, it was up from 39% to 41%. It was a very marginal increase there, but we thought it's important to record that as well, because a lot of spaces where, when it comes to women workers, availability of water is a very key factor in their employability, and in their access to employment spaces. So that's why we looked at water as well. When we look at whether they receive any kind of partial wages since lockdown. So yeah, almost roughly around 19% people said that their wages are up from 17%. In terms of food sufficiency, it had come down from 82% to 68%. And in terms of their outreach to healthcare, the healthcare centers, as we all know, in the first lockdown, almost everything was shut. So from 27%, they said that yes, 74% were able to access primary healthcare services when needed. I will not go in more in detail. These reports are available in the public domain, there are publication section in our ActionAid website, so they can be accessed here for more data and information. Can we go to the next slide, please? It's important here now to look at social security. I have broadly shared here, and as Dr. Rosa was also talking about need for children to attend look at schooling, what is happening. We realized that in a survey last year, which is almost it's September beginning now, and 49% of the workers, the children, were enrolled in public schools, and almost rough data which we have in our hand right now, none of those children are going back to school, and most of the girls are the ones who are dropped out, and the incidences of child marriages have increased. And but while the schools were open, 73% reported that they were getting midday meals in some form or the other, in the dry ration form or cooked meals. And 41% workers reported that their children were enrolled in ICDS, and 69% said that they could access it. Now, again, a very important point here to notice is this, that out of 38 crores informal workers, we reached out to just not even a fraction, a 0.000 something of workers, of which only 7% said that they were registered with some kind of a welfare board. So 7% of some 17,000 workers is a very less number, and being registered with a welfare board means that you have access to some kind of social security net, and that's where the government can transfer you some kind of unemployment allowance or social security. And so this is the fraction of people who got something as part of the package which our finance minister had announced. So we can imagine what happened to the rest of the 38 crore workers which are there. Then we look at Ayushman Bharat scheme. If we look at this health scheme, we only 13% said they had access to it, although 81% said that they could access during the unlock phase the scheme. But in terms of registration, the registrations have been very, very poor when it comes to social security access. And all this was taken note by the Supreme Court, by the NHRC. NHRC came up with 2 advisories on informal workers since the last year lockdown, and they have recommended to the government departments to look at social security of informal workers at a much closer range. And the recent Supreme Court order in June has kind of roped in the government to ensure that there has to be a national database on informal workers. On August 26th, the government launched an e-Shram portal trying to record the number of informal workers which are there. But till the time, each worker is, ensured ESI benefit, because India is a signatory to the Social Security Convention 1952 of ILO. And as part of, that entire, our own being attached to being a signatory to that entire convention means that we have to honor that convention, and that requires us to create schemes and programs for social security of informal workers, and ESI is one such scheme, and that's what we have been advocating. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I will come to our learnings from this survey, and I'll be pretty quick. I won't go point-wise in my slides. So one clear understanding, all of us, who are working with informal workers, is this, that till the time we create, safe migration routes, safe facilitation of migration for people who are looking for better employment, wages across states, this challenge will continue. And that means that there needs to be, setting up of workers facilitation centers. And again, here I would like to say that, the imagination of having these workers facilitation centers at the source and at the destination state is not a new thinking. It is part of the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act, but has never been implemented on the ground. So perhaps now more than ever we need these facilitation services, so that the worker who wants to migrate, say from Himachal Pradesh to Delhi, knows where to go in his panchayat, and how safely the worker can move to a metro city, work here, and is able to access social security, decent housing, and can go back and provide for the families. And that also means protection for women workers from trafficking, from exploitation, and from bondage. I'll go to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of recommendations, of course, we believe that, just like Professor Rosa was also mentioning, that there is clear need for universalization of schemes, such as, looking at public distribution system. At that point of time, when we did this study, there was no talk of one nation, one ration card scheme. We are very glad that one nation, one ration card scheme is out there now. But what is important for us is to see, and that's where the role of all of us in civil society comes, is that whether this one nation, one ration card scheme is being implemented on the ground in spirit, or workers are being denied, rations in states they are migrating. Second is, of course, at this point of time, the governments also realize that how important Manrega is when it comes to agricultural workers, when it comes to migrant workers in the villages, and how that needs to be strengthened, how more allocation needs to be done there, how it needs to be expanded from 100 days to 200 days, and how other kind of works can be included and be part of this process, and how it is important that unemployment allowance is given to a worker, because there's no point if the scheme is there which says that you are entitled for an unemployment allowance but is never given to the worker. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, another thing which has come to the center stage, and that's something which, again, we should collectively work and push towards, is having an urban employment scheme. And this kind of a scheme is already there in Odisha, Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, and Jharkhand. These schemes which are being implemented in these states need to be looked into. Their nuances need to be understood. Their implementation status need to be studied. And some kind of public works in urban sphere. It could be nursery. It could be upgradation of the footpaths, cycling paths. It could be we can call them creation of more green jobs, and monitoring and survey jobs were given to a lot of workers in these seropositivity surveys. All those jobs can be stitched together in an urban employment scheme framework, and state governments should engage in this kind of a scheme. Can we go to the next slide, please? Lastly, but most importantly, are the labor legislations and protections which are available to the workers. Now, we all know that there have been lately a lot of labor legislative changes, which includes coming up of the 4 codes, including the code on social security. What is important for us today is to see that these codes are looking at practicalities of the things, and right now the codes have been passed by the parliament, but the rules are not yet in force. states are supposed to draft the rules, and when the process of drafting these rules need to be consultative. Unions, worker associations, women labor groups should be consulted when these rules are being formed, so that we can ensure fair wages and universal social security to the workers. There are some other acts and instruments on the ground which, although are merged right now with the codes, but till the time codes are coming into effect, there is of course the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act implementation. There is this Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act. All these and the most recent is the registration of workers and e-Shram portal. These aspects need to be strengthened. Can we go to the next slide, please? There is, of course, a clear need to acknowledge women's work. So far, we don't really have a system where time use surveys are done to understand women's contribution to the GDP, and that's something which we need to acknowledge. There are, of course, economists who say that women's work stays unaccounted for, but what's also important is to note that women work participation ratios are continuously falling, and what are the reasons for that? Why are we not able to compute the care economy and create formal jobs for women, so that their contributions to the labor force can be acknowledged? So many we realize that it's the domestic workers today who are also on the front lines. They are serving and supporting the COVID affected families. There are the ASHA workers, they are the Anganwadi workers, they are the elderly care homes, where women are all in front line. But those spaces need to be looked for formalizations. There has to be a system where public services can be public services for women workers need to be improved, so that safety and security can be provided. Pressures need to be definitely there to provide quality care, and certain work such as home-based work, domestic work needs far more recognitions and better wages and working conditions. And lastly, but not most not least important, is this implementation of POSH Act. POSH Act is right now only looked in formal spaces, but that needs to be pushed in the informal working arrangements of women workers. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so that's like from my side, all kinds of questions are welcome. I'm around. Thank you, James. I hope I was able to manage the time.
Thank you, Smita, for sharing in detail about the informal sector, how the workers are being affected. The issues are highlighted in detail, and also very, very unique, very interesting one is what you have highlighted about various recommendations in terms of issue that 21% people are excluded from PDS. At the same time, the other recommendations that you have highlighted really very valuable in terms of worker facilitation center, and also the extending the NREGA and the PM the Garib Kalyan program. So that need to be extended, because now that is the time limit is November only, up to November only it is permitted. So this could be extended so that people can really have a phase out of this the challenges of this pandemic. The other thing is portal, registration of portal, SRAM portal, and all these things. Some the more vulnerable needs a lot of support. Somebody has to give a hand holding so that we can ensure 100% enrollment. The problem is the enrollment is less in terms of e-portal, so that most of the people are still excluded in terms of availing their benefits in workers-related security measures. And the Interstate Act, that will be very helpful if it is in place, so that the migrant workers can have a safe place of work. So thank you for all the recommendations that you have put forth. That is very, very valuable, and programmatically some of the NGOs can really take it forward and implement immediately. Now I just request Saiti Bon Emmanuel one of our colleague who will present very briefly about what he will not share about much of the issues because we are aware of the issues both the presenters have highlighted. So we will more look at the solutions, what are the interventions World Vision has implemented. So he will highlight on those. So I just request Sethi Brown Emmanuel to be present very briefly, then we will go to the question and answer session.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Neil. Let us move to the next slide. Yes, as we all know, we have done the rapid assessment in the month of May with 118 locations with 5,669 samples. And some of the recommendations or some of the short-term disruptions were also coming out of it, like the closed markets, the lack of transportation, and the long-term implications because of it also were very explicit in the survey. So let us go to the next slide. It's more important because we also keep track of our development indicators, especially when it comes to the livelihood. Here you can see in 2016 we have taken the measurements, 2019 we have taken the measurements, and 2021. And you can see from 2016 in 2019 we have increased the progress, especially in terms of secondary and alternative income sources, household having an income or earning member on a consistent basis, and parents or caregivers who are able to provide well for their children. So these are the indicators we have developed, and we have been tracking them and we have improved them. But after 2019, that is 2021, it has slipped back way beyond to 2016 level, as what our National Director, Mr. Madhav, said. So, that's a serious concern. It's not only in just livelihood isolated pockets, but it's affected all the sectors, including child health, nutrition, education, all of these sectors. So, that's why we decided and we drafted a pathway of change with a 5-pillar approach. Next slide, please. Yeah, as what National Director said, we have focused on increased access to social safety net, and increasing the dietary diversity, and restarting the businesses and restarting the farm and unskilled workers' livelihoods. And the 5th pillar, which is to have a network and partnership and leveraging resources from government as well to work together with government. So this is what the entire plan, and we touched around 350,000 families in these 2 years from the COVID season till March, yet to go till September to get the most data. Up to date till March, we have touched 250,000 families approximately. So this is what our interventions through social safety net access, through increased dietary diversity, through promotion of kitchen garden. We have seen farmers getting more support through inputs and marketing support and market support for processing their produce. And also we have seen household restarting businesses because of the enhanced inventory that they received from the livelihood, because most of them has exhausted their savings. Yeah. So the recommendations, what we would say is we need to focus more into the social safety net system, which is more for their resilience, as well as when it comes to their economic empowerment. We need to go for enterprises support schemes, which are not only with us, but also with the government in our larger scale. So we need to partner with them. That's more important, and we need to know, because the NREGA as well as the agriculture has been a shock absorber for us, but we need to see how much shocks we can observe. And also at the same time, we need to see what kind of support services that we need to have an enhanced livelihood. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Over to Dr. Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Sethi, for sharing the 5-pillar approach and the list of interventions. I think World Vision has reached out 273,000 beneficiaries over the past 1.5 years. during the COVID. That includes cash transfers and starting up of small businesses and agriculture intervention support, input support. So that's a great way in which some of the people have restarted their life, and you have seen the community voices in the beginning. So thank you, Saiti, for your presentation. And now, is there any questions for the panelists? We have seen some questions on the chat. It's about
yes, sir. We'll go to the question answer session. Before that, it's my duty to introduce Dr. Neil. His full name is James Neil Devasa. He's a head technical program in World Vision India. He facilitates child health and nutrition, education, and livelihood technical programs. Once again, I take this opportunity to thank the inaugural speaker, Mr. Madhav Sasachi, and then Dr. Shukla, and the wonderful panelists for your informative and thought-provoking. To the moderator, Dr. Neil, Dr. Rosa, and Ms. Saiti. We will go ahead and take some questions for now, and be sure to type your questions into the question box in the control panel. I'm handing over this time to Mr. Nirmal Kumar, Head Program Quality, Data Management and Strategy.
Thank you, Daniel. Just want to share that most of the questions have been responded either by the speakers or by the panelists. However, there is a hand raised from the audience. Can we ask Sunita Kamplate to first present her question? Can we unmute her? And yes, yes, please. Can somebody help in unmuting her? Daniel?
Yes, sir. I'm just trying to do it. She can actually unmute and talk. Sunita, you can unmute and talk. I think Sunita is not there. Can we move to the next question, sir?
Yeah, okay. Couple of them have said they have requested for the slides, and so we will be sending the slides, the presentation slides to the participants. If you have shared your email IDs to the organizers. That's a comment. I would like to just bring it to your attention.
Thank you.
I think basically these are some of the things that have already been answered. If we are able to unmute Daniel, one or two of them have raised their hands. If not, we have to proceed. Thank you. Over to you, Daniel. I am through.
Yeah. Hassan, can you help us to unmute those participants?
Yeah, we are allowing it, but participant has to accept that.
Okay.
I saw one more question on the chat, whether when we say universal basic services, they are asking what are those universal basic services. I think, may I request Dr. Rosa Abraham, which are the services that will come under universal services?
Neil, Dr. Rosa had to leave. I think she is not in the, there's a message from her.
Okay, thank you.
And drop in a mail so that we can export it.
So we can just answer that particular question through mail. So there are no further questions on the chat, and we will just close the Q&A system now since we have crossed more than 80 minutes. I'll request Dr. Anjana, our Senior Director Operation Quality, will share about the concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, and good afternoon to all of you. And this afternoon, for the last couple of hours, friends, it has been great for us to listen to all our eminent speakers. And I consider it a great privilege that we also got some deeper insights. Although pandemic, as Mother Belamkonda started in his opening remarks and shared that it has been a disruptor. It has created a lot of losses, and some losses have been temporary, yet some losses have been permanent. And mostly the livelihood have been affected very badly. However, in the last 2 hours, what we have heard from each and every eminent speaker, that livelihood need to be an enabler, and we need to consider that as an enabler for all the vulnerable people to bounce back in a time like this. So I have few pointers, friends, which I picked up from all our eminent speakers. Number one is, when we talk about most vulnerable children in our organization, we cannot talk that in isolation. We have to work alongside with the livelihood recovery program. And that needs to be given a top priority if we have to talk about the well-being of the most vulnerable children and the people in our community. Second, we also heard Mr. Satoshi. He talked about how do we formalize the informal economy? How do we mainstream the businesses? The MSME, which are being very badly impacted, needs to be further supported so that we have business continuity, which can be ensured. My third point is, we have heard from Dr. Shukla that the disparity between the rich and the poor had been widened. And it would take a long time for the unorganized sector people to recover. So it is a necessity that we as a community of development practitioners and decision makers, we come together and we foster and cultivate the job growth, and more attention to be given to the women, because women have been badly impacted during this pandemic. My fourth point is, we have heard from Dr. Rosa how even the permanent employed workers, their job security is also impaired because of various factors. We have also seen that they're also vulnerable. Now, how do we reduce that vulnerability? It is very, very imperative that we as a group need to work alongside with the government and to work on the recovery policy so that people's loss of job and the shock thereafter and the vulnerabilities that we see would be considerably reduced. And my fifth and the last point is, how do we as a group continue to influence and enhance the higher social security access for all, whether it is the vulnerable group or the informal workers. So ladies and gentlemen, we really would like to thank each one of you for being with us this afternoon and patiently listening to all our eminent speakers. I take this time to thank our National Director, Mr. Madhav Belamkonda, for being very supportive in this initiative. And thanks for sharing your thoughts, Madhav. I also would like to thank Mr. Satoshi Sasaki, the Deputy Director from ILO. Thank you, sir, for coming in and sharing a lot of inputs about the policy framework that ILO has put up to handle this issue. Thank you, Dr. Shukla. It has been a very technical session, yet we also understood how the GDP need to bounce back and how the informal sector needs to be supported. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Neil, for sharing your thoughts, Dr. Rosa and Smita and Mrs. Sethi. Thanks to all of you. You have really graced this occasion and you have informed us, and we really would like to thank each one of you. I really would like to thank all the participants for being here. Your comments, your suggestions, and your questions would be an input for us as we plan out our program in future. Last but not the least, I also would like to thank my colleagues, the organizing committee, for putting it all together and making it a success. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Anjana, the Senior Director, Program Quality, Strategic and Research. We really had a great time of learning. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Thanks again for joining us today in our Livelihood during Pandemic Challenges and Opportunities webinar. And I'm sure we will see you next time. Till then, take care and bye-bye.